He had 30 seconds to choose between his daughter's life-saving medicine and walking into a building that had already swallowed three men's careers and nearly their lives. Jace Callahan chose the building. What he found inside wasn't a wiring problem. It was a billion-dollar lie, buried under triple pay and dead silence, waiting for someone desperate enough not to ask questions. He was about to become the one man standing between a corporate cover-up and a catastrophe nobody outside that facility would survive. Stay with me to the end. Hit like. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The email came in at 11:42 on a Tuesday night, and Jace Callahan read it 3 times before he let himself believe it was real. Auxiliary Power Facility 7. Overnight Emergency Contract. $4,200 flat rate. Immediate start required. He sat at the kitchen table with the laptop screen throwing pale light across his face, and in the next room he could hear Mia's breathing through the baby monitor he still used even though she was 6 years old and would have been embarrassed to know about it. Steady. Even. Good. That was the sound he listened for every night before he let himself sleep, the sound that told him she wasn't having one of the bad nights, the nights when her lungs tightened up and her lips went the color of skim milk. $4,200. That was 3 months of her medication. That was the copay on the specialist in Charlotte that her pediatrician kept telling him to see, the one who actually understood pediatric asthma combined with the heart murmur nobody could fully explain. That was breathing room, literally and figuratively, for a man who hadn't had any in 2 years. He scrolled down the listing again. The pay was triple the standard rate for an overnight electrical inspection, which told him exactly 2 things. 1, the job was dangerous. 2, nobody else wanted it. He'd been a journeyman electrician for 4 years now, ever since he got out of the Navy and discovered that the only things he was qualified to do on paper were kill people efficiently and follow chains of command, neither of which translated well to civilian job applications. The electrical apprenticeship had been his brother-in-law's idea. Dale was a master electrician with his own small outfit in Gastonia, and he'd looked at Jace across a folding table at a cookout 4 years ago and said, "You've got the hands for it, and the discipline for it, and Lord knows you need something steady." Steady. That word had become a kind of prayer for Jace, except he didn't pray anymore, hadn't really since Afghanistan, since the things he'd seen that made the idea of a benevolent anything sitting up there watching it all happen feel like a cruel joke. So steady was what he asked the universe for instead. Steady work. Steady pay. Steady ground under Mia's feet, since the rest of her life had been such an unsteady thing. Her mother gone before she turned 2, gone the way some people go, just driving away one afternoon and never circling back. No explanation, just absence where a person used to be. He looked at the listing again. Auxiliary Power Facility 7. He knew the building. Everybody in the trade around here knew it, the way you know which roads flood every spring or which bar to avoid on a Friday night. It sat about 40 minutes outside the city, a sprawling industrial campus that used to support one of Kensington Global Technology's main data centers before they'd built a newer facility and left this one running as backup power infrastructure. Word on the crew channels was that it was cursed, though nobody used that word out loud because grown men with mortgages didn't believe in curses. What they believed in was the fact that 3 different contractors had gone in over the past year and come out with stories that didn't quite add up. One guy, Pruitt, a wiry old-timer who'd been doing industrial work since before Jace was born, had gone in for a routine inspection and come out 40 minutes later, ash white, refusing to say what he'd seen, refusing to ever take another job there, even when the company doubled the offer. Another tech had been hospitalized with burns. Nobody could fully explain on paperwork that read like it had been written by someone trying very hard not to say what actually happened. A third had simply quit the trade altogether, packed up, and moved to Tennessee, and when people asked why, all he'd say was that some buildings weren't worth the money. Jace had heard all of this the way you hear ghost stories. Interesting, slightly unsettling, ultimately irrelevant to his actual life, because he'd never had a reason to go near the place. Until now. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and Mia's steady breath through the monitor, and, somewhere outside, a dog barking 3 houses down. He thought about combat zones. He thought about Helmand Province at 2 in the morning, about the particular quality of silence right before something happened, a silence that had texture to it if you knew how to listen. He thought about the men he'd served with, men who didn't make it home, and the strange guilt of being the one who did, a guilt that never fully left no matter how many years passed. He was not afraid of buildings. He had stopped being afraid of buildings a long time ago. He opened the laptop again and accepted the contract. The drive out to the facility took him through the kind of countryside that looked abandoned even when it wasn't. Fields gone fallow, a couple of trailer parks, a Baptist church with a marquee that still read Christmas blessings even though it was March. His truck, a 2014 F-150 with 190,000 miles on it, and a check engine light he'd long since learned to ignore, rattled over a stretch of county road that hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. In the passenger seat sat his toolbox, his multimeter, his thermal camera. The good one. The one he'd bought used off a contractor friend who was getting out of the business. The one piece of equipment he actually trusted completely. In his back pocket was a folded photograph of Mia from her last school picture day, gap-toothed grin, hair he'd tried and mostly failed to braid himself that morning because some habits from his deployments never left him, like always carrying something of the people you were protecting. He'd called his sister Renee before he left. "You're going to that place?" Her voice had that particular pitch she got when she was trying not to sound worried and failing completely. "Jace, everybody talks about that building. Everybody talks about a lot of things, Ren. Pruitt wouldn't even tell me what happened to him. Pruitt, the man's done electrical work since 1987. He's not exactly a nervous type." "I need the money." There'd been a long pause on the line, the kind that said more than words could. Renee had 2 kids of her own and a husband who worked construction, and she understood, better than almost anyone, the particular math that desperate parents did at midnight, weighing risk against need until the equation came out the only way it could. "Just be careful," she'd said finally, "and call me when you're out. Doesn't matter what time." "I will." He hadn't told her about Mia's appointment with the cardiologist that morning, the one where the doctor had used the phrase, "We want to keep a close eye on this," in that careful, measured tone doctors used when they were trying not to alarm you while still telling you something was wrong. He hadn't told her about the new medication that wasn't covered by his insurance, the one that cost $340 a month, the one Mia needed for her lungs to work the way lungs were supposed to work. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. He'd made the decision the moment he saw the number on that contract. Bish. The facility rose up out of the dark like something that had been built by people who'd stopped caring what it looked like. All corrugated metal and chain-link fencing and sodium lights that buzzed and flickered against a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise. A faded sign at the gate read, "Kensington Global Technologies, Auxiliary Power Facility. 7. Authorized personnel only." And below it, someone had posted a newer sign, slightly crooked, that simply said, "Audible alarm system temporarily offline for maintenance." Jace sat in his truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at that second sign for longer than he probably needed to. Audible alarm system offline. In a facility housing what was, according to the work order, a battery storage network capable of powering half a data center campus in an emergency. That was the kind of detail that, in his old line of work, would have made every hair on the back of his neck stand up. You didn't disable alarms in places where things could go very wrong very fast. You especially didn't disable them and then leave a sign up about it like it was a minor inconvenience, like it was a bathroom out of order. He got out of the truck anyway. Triple Pay didn't care about his instincts. The security guard at the gate was an older man named Lonnie, who looked like he hadn't slept properly in about a decade, with the particular gray pallor of someone working too many night shifts for too little money. "You the electrician?" Lonnie asked, not looking up from his phone. "Jace Callahan. Got a work order for an overnight systems inspection." Lonnie finally looked up, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, of what kind of man volunteered for this particular job. Or maybe just tired curiosity. "You know this building's got a reputation." "I've heard. 3 guys before you. One of them I drove to the hospital myself." Lonnie's eyes drifted to the dark hulk of the building behind the fence. "I don't go past the gate after dark anymore. Corporate says I gotta, contract says I gotta, but I don't. I sit right here. Appreciate the warning." "Wasn't a warning, just telling you what I know." Lonnie buzzed him through. "Building's open. Main electrical room's on sub-level 2. Elevator's been finicky, might want to take the stairs. Jace grabbed his gear and walked toward the entrance, and behind him, he heard Lonnie mutter something that might have been good luck or might have been a prayer. He couldn't quite tell which. And either way, it didn't matter, because Jace had stopped believing prayers did anything useful a long time ago. The inside of the facility hit him with a wall of stale, recycled air and the low electric hum that lived in every industrial building like this. A sound so constant you stopped hearing it after the first few minutes. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly amber glow. Half the overhead fixtures were dark, either burned out or never replaced, and his footsteps echoed down a long corridor lined with server racks behind reinforced glass, all of it dark and dormant, waiting for the day it might be needed again. He found the stairwell to sub-level 2 and went down, his boots ringing against the metal steps, his toolbox bumping against his thigh with each step. The temperature dropped as he descended, then started climbing again somewhere around the second landing, which struck him as wrong before he could fully articulate why. Cooling systems in a facility like this should have kept temperatures consistent, especially this close to a battery storage network, where heat management wasn't a comfort issue, it was a safety issue. He pushed through the door at sub-level 2 and stepped into the main electrical room. It was bigger than he'd expected, a cavernous space lined with row after row of battery racks, gray metal cabinets stacked 3 high, snaking back into shadow further than his flashlight could fully illuminate. A massive HVAC unit sat dormant in the corner, vents silent. Cable runs crisscrossed the ceiling like exposed veins, and everywhere on every surface was a fine layer of dust that told him nobody had done real maintenance in this room in a very long time, despite what he was certain the official records would claim. He set down his toolbox and pulled out his clipboard with the work order. Routine inspection of battery management system, thermal regulation verification, standard safety compliance check, standard language for what should have been a standard job. Nothing about this room felt standard. He started with the thermal camera, the way he always did, sweeping it slowly across the first row of battery racks, watching the screen render the cold blues and greens of normal operating temperature. Then he reached the third row, and the screen lit up orange. He stopped walking, checked the calibration, swept the camera back across the same section, orange, edging toward red, in a cluster of cells that should have been reading the same cool blue as everything around them. His pulse didn't spike. 8 years in the Navy had trained that reflex out of him, replaced it with something flatter and more useful, a kind of cold clarity that arrived exactly when he needed it most. He crouched down and examined the rack more closely, running his hand along the casing without touching the terminals, feeling heat radiating through the metal that had no business being there in a system supposedly operating within normal parameters. He pulled out his laptop and connected to the facility's local monitoring terminal, the one mounted on the wall beside the main electrical panel, expecting it to confirm what his camera was already telling him. Instead, the screen displayed a clean, orderly dashboard, every sensor reading green, every system nominal. Battery temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, well within operational range. He looked from the screen to the thermal camera in his hand, which was currently displaying a temperature reading of 94 degrees in that same section. "That's not right," he said out loud, to nobody, his voice swallowed up by the cavernous room. He'd seen this before, in a different context, a different life. Equipment readouts that told a story the equipment itself contradicted. In Afghanistan, it had meant tampered intel, false reports sent up the chain to make commanders feel safer than they should have. Here, in a power facility outside a small Carolina town, it meant something just as dangerous, dressed up in different clothes. Someone had falsified the monitoring system. He spent the next 40 minutes documenting everything methodically, the way he'd been trained to document anything that might matter later. Photographs of the thermal readings, photographs of the dashboard's false green numbers, a log of timestamps, a physical inspection of the wiring leading from the battery sensors to the central monitoring hub. And that was where he found it, tucked behind a service panel that had clearly been opened and closed multiple times by someone who didn't want it to look opened and closed at all. A bypass relay. Crude, but effective. Someone had rerouted the sensor data from the actual battery cells through a secondary unit that fed the monitoring system pre-programmed safe readings instead of live data. It wasn't sloppy work. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing, knew exactly how to make a dangerous system look perfectly fine on paper, while it quietly cooked itself toward failure in the dark. Jace sat back on his heels and stared at the relay for a long moment, feeling something settle into his chest that he recognized from a dozen deployments. Not fear, exactly, but the specific weight of knowing something other people needed to know and didn't. He thought about Pruitt, the old-timer who'd come out of this building 40 minutes into a job and refused to ever discuss what he'd seen. He thought about the tech who'd been hospitalized with burns the paperwork couldn't explain. He thought about the alarm system, conveniently disabled, the sign at the gate treating it like routine maintenance. This wasn't an accident waiting to happen. This was a disaster someone had built, brick by brick, decision by decision, and then hidden behind false numbers on a screen. He pulled out his phone to call the facility's emergency maintenance line, the number listed on his work order for exactly this kind of situation, and let it ring 6 times before a tired voice picked up. Maintenance dispatch, this is Carl. This is Jace Callahan. I'm doing the overnight inspection at Facility 7, Sublevel 2. I'm reading critical thermal anomalies in the battery storage network that aren't showing up on the facility monitoring system. I think you've got a falsified sensor feed and a battery bank running dangerously hot. A pause. The particular kind of pause that told Jace this wasn't the first time someone had called in concerns about this building. Can you send me what you're seeing? Photos? Readings? Already documented, but somebody needs to get eyes on this tonight, not in the morning. This thing could... Look, man, I hear you, but I'm just dispatch. I log what you tell me, somebody reviews it during business hours. That's the process. The process is going to get somebody killed. Another pause, longer this time, and when Carl spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, like he was checking over his shoulder, even though he was clearly alone in some office somewhere. Listen, you're not the first guy to call this in. I've logged complaints about that building 4 times in the last year. Nothing happens. Corporate doesn't want that facility flagged for shutdown, not with what it's costing them already to keep the new data center running at capacity. You want my honest advice? Document everything, finish your contract, and get out of there. Don't expect anybody upstairs to thank you for the warning. The line went dead, and Jay stood alone in that humming, amber-lit room, surrounded by a quiet catastrophe that nobody with the power to stop it seemed to want to see. Oh, he could have left. That thought crossed his mind more than once over the next hour, as he worked methodically through the rest of his inspection, documenting every discrepancy, every falsified reading, every piece of evidence that something was deeply, deliberately wrong inside this building. Triple pay didn't require him to be a hero. It required him to complete an inspection and submit a report, and if the people who received that report chose to ignore it, that wasn't technically his problem. But he thought about Mia, asleep at home with her steady breathing, the little girl who'd never once complained about the nights he had to work, who'd hugged him this morning before school with an intensity that still hadn't left his chest, who trusted him completely, and without question because that was what 6-year-olds did with the people who showed up for them. He thought about what kind of man he wanted to be in her eyes, not the version he performed for her, but the actual underlying truth of himself, the part that existed when nobody was watching and there was no reward for doing the right thing. He thought about the men he'd served with who hadn't made it home, who died doing things that mattered, and the particular guilt he carried for surviving when they hadn't. A guilt that only quieted, even briefly, when he did something that justified the life he'd been given instead of them. He kept working. Around 2 a.m., he found the maintenance logs, stored in a locked cabinet he had to pick because nobody had given him the key, a fact that struck him as significant in itself. The logs were a binder of handwritten entries going back 14 months, and as he flipped through them by flashlight, a pattern emerged that made his stomach tighten. Every entry noted minor irregularities. Slight temperature fluctuation, rack 7, resolved. Sensor recalibration, sector C, complete. Routine maintenance, battery bank 3, no issues found. Each entry, on its surface, looked like the kind of mundane documentation any facility generated. But Jace had spent 4 years reading equipment logs for a living, and he knew the difference between genuine maintenance records and a paper trail designed to look like one. The handwriting changed periodically, different technicians over the months, which made sense given the turnover this place apparently saw. But certain entries, the ones noting the most serious irregularities, were always followed within days by a second entry in different handwriting, marking the issue as resolved with no detail about what the resolution actually involved. No work orders, no parts replaced, no technician sign-off matching the original report. Someone was erasing problems on paper instead of fixing them in reality. He photographed every page of that binder, his hand steady, even as the implications of what he was looking at settled into something cold and certain in his chest. This wasn't negligence. Negligence looked different, sloppier, more random, the natural result of an underfunded facility cutting corners out of incompetence rather than intent. This was organized. This was deliberate. Somebody, somewhere above the maintenance crews and dispatch operators, had decided that the cost of fixing this facility properly was less acceptable than the cost of hiding the fact that it needed fixing at all. He thought about the phrase Carl had used. Corporate doesn't want that facility flagged for shutdown. He thought about what a shutdown might cost a company the size of Kensington Global Technologies. Millions, probably, in lost capacity, in scrambling to find alternative power infrastructure, in the kind of operational disruption that made shareholders nervous and stock prices dip. He thought about how much cheaper it was, from a certain kind of calculating perspective, to just keep the lie running instead. It was nearly 3 a.m. when he made his way back up toward the main floor to call his sister, the way he'd promised, and to get a signal strong enough to send copies of his documentation to his own personal email as backup, just in case. The stairwell felt colder going up than it had going down. Or maybe that was just his own nerves finally catching up with the adrenaline that had been carrying him through the last several hours. He stepped out into the main corridor and nearly collided with someone coming the other direction. A woman, mid-30s maybe, wearing a facility uniform with a badge that read security, her expression tight and alert in a way that told him she hadn't expected to encounter anyone either. "Didn't know anyone else was working tonight," Jay said, keeping his voice level. "I do the overnight security rounds. Most nights nobody's even here." She looked at him for a long moment, something assessing in her expression. "You're the electrician." Jace Callahan. "Denise Whitfield." She glanced past him toward the stairwell he'd just come from, toward sublevel 2. And something in her face shifted, careful and guarded. "You been down in the battery room?" "Most of the night." "Find anything?" It was a simple question, but the way she asked it, the particular weight she put on it, told Jace this wasn't idle curiosity. He studied her for a moment, making the kind of read he'd learned to make quickly in the field, judging whether someone in front of him was a threat, an ally, or something undecided. "I think you already know what I found," he said. Something in Denise's posture loosened, just slightly, like a held breath finally released. "I've worked security here for 2 years. I've watched 4 different contractors go in and out of that room, and every single one of them comes out looking like they saw a ghost. Nobody ever talks about what they saw. I always figured it was because corporate makes them sign something on the way out." She lowered her voice even though the corridor was empty. "But you don't look like a man who's about to keep quiet." "I'm a man who's about to finish my contract and file an honest report," Jace said. "What happens after that isn't up to me." "It should be up to somebody." Denise's jaw tightened. "I've seen the maintenance trucks come in the middle of the night sometimes, off the books, no paperwork through the normal channels. I've seen executives walk through here in suits that cost more than my yearly salary, never once asking a security guard or a maintenance tech what's actually going on, just nodding at numbers on a screen somebody hands them. This building is going to hurt somebody. I've felt it for a year now. I just never had proof." "You might have it now," Jace said. "Or at least I do. Question is whether anybody with the power to act on it actually wants to see it." Denise was quiet for a moment, studying him. "There's a woman," she said finally. "New CEO. Took over the company about 8 months ago when her father stepped down. Health reasons, officially, though there's been talk it was something else. Aurora Kensington. I've seen her in the building maybe twice, doing site visits the executives clearly didn't want her doing. She asks real questions, not the kind you can answer with a PowerPoint." Jace filed the name away without much expectation attached to it. In his experience, the people at the very top of organizations like this rarely saw the world the way the people on the ground did. Polished reports had a way of insulating leadership from inconvenient truths, and most leadership, if he was honest, preferred it that way. "I appreciate the conversation," he said, "but I've got about 3 more hours on this contract, and I intend to use every minute of it documenting exactly what's wrong in that room." Denise nodded slowly. "Be careful down there. Whatever's happening with those batteries, It's not slowing down. I can feel the air change in this building some nights. Tonight's one of those nights." She continued on her rounds, and Jace stood alone in the corridor for a moment, turning her words over in his mind. Tonight's one of those nights. He didn't believe in premonitions any more than he believed in prayers, but he'd learned, over years of combat deployments, never to fully dismiss the instincts of people who spent enough time inside a dangerous situation to develop a feel for it. Denise had been walking these halls for 2 years. If she said something felt wrong tonight specifically, that was data, even if it wasn't the kind of data his thermal camera could capture. He went back down to sub-level 2. The temperature in the battery room had climbed, even in the short time he'd been away. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that his thermal camera confirmed what his own body could already feel, a subtle wrongness in the air, a heat that didn't belong in a room theoretically maintained at controlled climate conditions. He worked faster now, driven by something he didn't fully articulate even to himself, some instinct honed across years of recognizing the difference between a situation that was bad and a situation that was about to become catastrophic. He traced the bypass relay back to its source, confirmed which specific battery racks were running hottest, cross-referenced those racks against the falsified maintenance logs, and began to build a complete picture of exactly how bad this situation actually was. The battery network, according to the original installation specifications he found in an old binder shoved at the back of a supply closet, had been designed to provide emergency backup power for roughly 6 hours at full data center load. Lithium-ion cells, densely packed, capable of catastrophic thermal runaway, if even a small percentage of cells overheated without proper cooling and isolation. He was looking, right now, at evidence that approximately 15% of one major battery cluster was running significantly above safe operating temperature, with no functioning cooling response, no alert triggering anywhere in the system, and no maintenance scheduled to address it. 15% didn't sound like much, but Jace had read enough about thermal runaway cascades during his electrical apprenticeship to understand exactly how this kind of failure worked. It didn't stay contained at 15%. Once enough cells in proximity reached critical temperature, the heat they generated triggered neighboring cells to follow. A chain reaction that could move from a contained problem to a catastrophic one in a matter of minutes once it truly began. And in a facility where the alarm system was conveniently disabled, where the monitoring dashboard displayed false readings, where nobody upstairs wanted to hear about problems that cost money to fix, there would be no warning, no time. Just whoever happened to be in the building when it finally went, dealing with consequences nobody outside had prepared them for. He sat back against a support column, running his hand over his face, feeling the particular exhaustion that came from holding too much knowledge at once, with too little power to act on it immediately. He thought about calling 911, but what would he even report? A private facility's internal equipment malfunction? No immediate fire? No immediate explosion? Just a slow-motion disaster building in the dark that local emergency services had no jurisdiction or expertise to address? He thought about calling the news, but he had no proof yet that would hold up against a company with the resources to bury an inconvenient story before it ever aired. What he had was documentation. Photographs, thermal readings, falsified logs, a paper trail nobody had bothered to fully cover because nobody had expected someone like him to actually look. He finished his contracted inspection at 5:47 a.m. as the first gray light of dawn began filtering weakly through the high windows near the main entrance. He documented everything he possibly could. Over 200 photographs, detailed notes, copies of the falsified maintenance logs he'd discreetly photographed page by page. Thermal readings time-stamped and organized into a report that any competent engineer would recognize immediately as evidence of a building actively approaching disaster. He gathered his tools, his laptop, his thermal camera, and made his way back up through the quiet building toward the exit, toward the gray morning light and the prospect of finally getting home to see Mia before she left for school, to hold her for a minute before the world's ordinary demands reasserted themselves over his night. Lonnie was still at the gate, looking even more exhausted than he had at midnight. "Make it through okay?" Lonnie asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he genuinely wondered. "Made it through." Jace stopped at the gate, looked back once at the building behind him, amber emergency lights still glowing faintly through the high windows, even as morning broke around it. "Lonnie? You got a number for facility management?" Somebody actually in charge, not dispatch. There's a regional ops director, guy named Mercer. Why? Because somebody needs to shut down that battery network before it shuts itself down the hard way. Lonnie's expression went carefully blank, the particular blankness of a man who'd learned a long time ago that some warnings weren't his to carry. I just watched the gate, man, but if you're thinking about calling Mercer, be ready for him to tell you it's not your concern anymore. Contract's over. You did your job. My job was to find out what was wrong in there. I found it. Now somebody with actual authority needs to listen. He climbed into his truck, his whole body aching with the particular exhaustion of a night spent in heightened alertness, the adrenaline finally draining out of him now that he was back in the relative safety of his own vehicle. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the facility one last time in his rearview mirror, a building full of people's carefully ignored warnings, a building that, by his professional estimation, was weeks away from a disaster nobody currently in a position of power seemed willing to prevent. He thought about Aurora Kensington, the name Denise had mentioned, the new CEO who apparently asked real questions. He didn't know yet whether she was someone who would actually listen, or just another name attached to a company that had already proven, through 14 months of falsified logs and disabled alarms, exactly how little it valued the truth when the truth was inconvenient. But he knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd documented. And he knew, with the same certainty that had once guided him through combat zones half a world away, that he wasn't going to let this go quietly, no matter how badly the people in charge wanted him to. He started the truck and pulled out onto the county road as the sun fully broke over the horizon, painting the fields gold, and somewhere behind him, in the dark heart of a building, everyone was too afraid to look at. Honestly, a clock he couldn't see was quietly, steadily, counting down. Mercer's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building 40 minutes from the facility, and Jace got there by 8:30, running on no sleep, and 3 cups of gas station coffee that sat sour in his stomach. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and the practiced smile of someone trained to deflect, told him Mr. Mercer was in back-to-back meetings all morning. Jace said he'd wait. He waited 2 hours. When Mercer finally came out, a tall man in his 50s with the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than outdoor work, he looked at Jace's clipboard and folder of printed photographs with the expression of a man being asked to look at someone else's vacation pictures. "You're the overnight tech from Facility 7. Jace Callahan, I need 15 minutes. I've got 2. Mercer didn't sit down, which Jace understood immediately as a message. This conversation wasn't going to last long enough to need chairs. Jace laid it out anyway, fast and precise, the way he used to brief commanding officers when timing mattered more than comfort. The thermal readings, the bypass relay, the falsified dashboard, the maintenance logs with their pattern of phantom resolutions. He slid the folder across the desk, open to the photograph of the relay itself, wires spliced in a way that left no room for innocent explanation. Mercer glanced at it for maybe 4 seconds. "Mr. Callahan, I appreciate the thoroughness. I do. But that facility has been inspected and certified by our internal engineering team multiple times this year. If there were a genuine safety issue, it would have been flagged through proper channels. It was flagged multiple times according to your own dispatch logs. Carl told me himself, 4 complaints in the last year, nothing done." Something flickered behind Mercer's eyes, gone almost before Jace caught it. "Dispatch logs aren't engineering assessments. Look, I'm going to be straight with you because you clearly put in real effort here, and I respect that. That facility is scheduled for full decommission in 18 months once the new campus reaches capacity. Shutting it down early, even temporarily, would require pulling backup power redundancy for a data center supporting 20-some major clients. That's not a decision I make. That's not a decision anyone in this building makes lightly. With respect, sir, in 20 minutes, you're talking about the cost. I'm talking about a battery network that's running 15% of its cells above safe thermal limits with no functioning alarm system. That's not a budget conversation. That's people's lives." Mercer's jaw tightened, the first real crack in his corporate composure. "I'll forward your report to engineering for review." "When?" "When it's appropriate." "That facility doesn't have an appropriate timeline, Mr. Mercer. It has a clock running on it, and nobody upstairs seems to want to look at it." Mercer closed the folder and slid it back across the desk, his expression settling into something colder and more final. Your contract is complete. You'll be paid in full. I'd suggest you let our engineering team handle the technical assessment from here. That's their job. Yours was an overnight inspection, and you did it. Thank you for your service. The phrase landed wrong, the way people sometimes used it without understanding what it actually cost the men who'd earned it. And Jay stood there for a second, feeling something hot and useless climb up the back of his throat. He picked the folder back up. I'm keeping copies, he said. Of everything? That's your prerogative. Mercer was already turning back toward his office. Have a good day, Mr. Callahan. Jace sat in his truck in the parking garage for a long time before he started the engine, the folder open on the passenger seat, 200 photographs of a building quietly cooking itself toward disaster, while a man in a 14th floor office worried about redundancy contracts and decommission timelines. He thought about driving straight to a local news station. He thought about it seriously, turned the idea over while his hands gripped the wheel, but he also knew, with the clear-eyed practicality that had kept him alive through 2 deployments, exactly how that would likely play out. A contractor with no engineering degree, no institutional credibility, walking into a newsroom with photographs and claims about a private facility. Companies like Kensington Global had legal teams whose entire job was making stories like that disappear before they ever aired. He'd be discredited, maybe sued for breach of some confidentiality clause buried in his contract paperwork, and the building would keep running exactly the way it had been running, just with better locks on the supply closet. He needed someone with actual power who would actually look. He thought about Denise's words from the corridor at 3 a.m. Aurora Kensington. She asked real questions, not the kind you can answer with a PowerPoint. He didn't have her direct contact information, obviously. A man like him didn't have the email address of a Fortune 500 CEO sitting in his phone. But he had something almost as good. 4 years in this trade had taught him that corporate websites always listed an investor relations contact, a general inquiries line, sometimes even a tip line for safety concerns, buried somewhere in the fine print nobody read. He found it on his phone in the parking garage. A safety compliance email address monitored, according to the website, by the office of the CEO. He almost laughed, probably monitored by some assistant's assistant who'd skim it for 30 seconds before forwarding it to exactly the kind of executive who just told him to have a good day. He sent it anyway. Attached every photograph, every thermal reading, every page of the falsified maintenance log. He wrote 3 paragraphs, plain and direct, no embellishment, because embellishment was for people who didn't have the actual evidence to let speak for itself. He signed it with his full name and his phone number and hit send before he could talk himself out of it. Then he drove home to see his daughter before school because whatever happened next, that part of his life didn't stop just because a building 40 minutes away was quietly dying in the dark. Mia was at the kitchen table eating cereal when he walked in, still in her pajamas, hair sticking up on one side the way it always did after she slept on it wrong, and the sight of her hit him the way it always did after a hard night, like something in his chest finally unclenched. "Daddy!" She didn't get up because 6-year-olds had priorities and cereal was clearly one of them, but she grinned at him with milk on her chin. "Aunt Renee made me breakfast. She said you were working all night again." "I was." He crouched down beside her chair, brushed her hair back from her face, checked, the way he always checked, automatically now, a habit he hated needing. The color of her lips, the rhythm of her breathing. Fine. Good. Normal. "You feeling okay this morning, baby girl?" "I'm fine, Daddy." She said it with the particular exasperation of a child who'd answered that question 1,000 times and found it tiresome by the 400th. "Did you fix the lights?" Something like that. Renee came in from the laundry room, took one look at his face, and her expression shifted into the specific worry she reserved for him alone. "You look like hell." "Long night." "You said you'd call." "I know. I'm sorry. It got complicated." He glanced at Mia, who was absorbed in her cereal bowl, swimming a single Cheerio in slow circles, and lowered his voice. "I found something out there, Ren. Something bad. Real bad." Renee's eyes narrowed. "How bad?" "Battery system running hot, falsified safety records, alarms turned off on purpose. I took it to facility management this morning, and they basically told me to mind my own business." Jesus, Jace. She caught herself, glanced at Mia, lowered her own voice further. What are you going to do? I already did it. Sent everything to the CEO's office an hour ago. Probably won't go anywhere. But I had to try. Renee studied him for a long moment, the particular look she'd been giving him since they were kids, since their own father had walked out and left her, at 14, essentially raising her younger brother through the worst of it. She knew him better than almost anyone alive. She knew the shape of his stubbornness, the specific kind that came from a man who'd spent years being told what to do, and now, in civilian life, refused to ever again stay quiet about something he knew was wrong. Just be careful, she said. Companies like that don't like being told they're wrong, especially not by guys like you. Guys like me? Guys with nothing to lose and everything to protect. She nodded toward Mia. That's a dangerous combination, Jace. You know that better than anybody. He didn't have an answer for that, because she wasn't wrong, and he spent the rest of that morning getting Mia ready for school, walking her to the bus stop on legs heavy with exhaustion, watching her climb the steps with her backpack nearly as big as she was, and thinking the whole time about a clock running somewhere inside a building full of lies. 40 floors above the city, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a skyline she still wasn't entirely used to claiming as her own, Aurora Kensington was reading a report that made absolutely no sense to her. It was Thursday's quarterly operations summary, the kind of document her executive team produced like clockwork, dense with charts and green check marks and language carefully engineered to convey competence without inviting questions. Facility 7's section read exactly like every other section, operating within normal parameters, no outstanding maintenance concerns, decommission timeline on schedule. She'd read variations of that same sentence about Facility 7 in 4 consecutive quarterly reports now, and something about its consistency bothered her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Not yet. It was too clean, too uniform. In her experience, 8 years building her own logistics software company from nothing before her father's health forced her into a role she'd never asked for and wasn't entirely sure she wanted. Nothing in operations ever stayed perfectly, uniformly fine for that long. Systems had quirks, equipment had hiccups. Real operational reports had texture, small inconsistencies, the natural noise of actual machines being run by actual people. This read like it had been written once and copy-pasted forward, quarter after quarter, with nobody actually checking whether the underlying reality still matched the words. She'd mentioned it once to her COO, a man named Holt Renfield, who'd been with the company 11 years longer than she had, who'd been close with her father, who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once been questioned by the people above him. Facility 7's old infrastructure, Aurora. It's stable specifically because it's simple. Nothing fancy to go wrong. He'd said it with a smile that was meant to be reassuring and instead struck her as faintly condescending, the tone certain men used with her specifically, the tone that assumed her success in software somehow didn't translate to understanding hardware, as if competence didn't transfer, as if she hadn't spent her 20s learning to read a balance sheet and a systems architecture diagram with equal fluency. I'd still like a site visit, she'd told him. Of course, I'll have someone schedule it. That had been 6 weeks ago. Nobody had scheduled it. She was still thinking about that conversation, turning it over with the particular persistence that had built her first company out of a garage and a maxed-out credit card, when her assistant, Priya, knocked on the open door of her office with an expression Aurora had learned to read carefully over the past 8 months. There's an email I think you need to see directly. It came in through the safety compliance inbox about an hour ago. Normally that gets triaged before it reaches you, but Priya hesitated. I read it myself. I think you should look at it before anyone filters it. Aurora set down her coffee. Show me. She read Jace Callahan's email twice, the way Jace himself had read his contract offer twice the night before, except for entirely different reasons. The language was plain, almost blunt, none of the careful corporate hedging she was used to reading from her own executives. I documented falsified sensor readings. I found a physical bypass relay rerouting battery temperature data to the central monitoring system. I found 14 months of maintenance logs showing a consistent pattern of problems noted and then marked resolved with no corresponding work performed. Attached were photographs, over 200 of them, organized and time-stamped with the kind of methodical precision she recognized from engineers she respected, not the kind of evidence a man padding an insurance claim or angling for a payout would bother producing. She clicked through a dozen of them slowly. Thermal imaging that practically glowed orange and red against a dashboard screenshot showing the same section reading a placid, impossible 68 degrees. She felt something cold settle into her stomach. "Get me everything we have on Facility 7, she said. "Maintenance contracts, inspection history, every report filed in the last 2 years, and find out who Jace Callahan is." Already pulled his information. Independent contractor, licensed electrician, 4 years in the trade, former Navy. He did one overnight job there last night. "One night," Aurora repeated. "And he found this in one night, while my own engineering team has been certifying that facility as fine for over a year." Priya didn't answer because there wasn't really an answer that wouldn't implicate someone, and they both knew it. Aurora picked up her desk phone and called Holt Renfield directly, something she rarely did, preferring the formality of scheduled meetings to spontaneous confrontation, but this didn't feel like a moment for formality. "Holt, I need to talk to you about Facility 7. "Aurora, I've got board prep in 20 minutes. Can this—" "No, it can't wait." She kept her voice level, controlled, the same tone she'd used countless times negotiating with investors twice her age who'd underestimated her. "I just received a report from an electrical contractor who did an overnight inspection there. He's documented falsified thermal sensor data, a physical bypass device feeding false readings to the monitoring system, and over a year of maintenance logs that don't match what was actually done. I want to know how this happened under a facility our engineering team has certified as fine in 4 consecutive quarterly reports." The pause on the other end of the line lasted just slightly too long. "Aurora, contractors exaggerate. It's not unusual for a tech doing a one-night job to misread equipment he's not fully trained on, or to inflate a report hoping for a bigger contract down the line. He's a licensed electrician with thermal imaging documentation and photographs of an actual physical device wired into the system. This isn't a misunderstanding, Holt. Someone built that bypass relay. Someone wrote 14 months of fake resolution entries in a maintenance log. That doesn't happen by accident. I'll have engineering investigate. I want a full independent assessment of that facility within the week. Not engineering reviewing engineering's own work. An outside firm. That's going to raise questions with the board, and frankly, with our investors. If word gets out, we're commissioning outside audits of our own infrastructure. It signals we don't trust our internal... I don't trust our internal processes right now, Holt. That's exactly the point. Her voice stayed even, but there was steel under it now. The same steel that had carried her through 6 years of investors telling her a 26-year-old woman couldn't possibly run a logistics company. Get me the assessment, and get me everything related to that contractor's report. Every internal communication about Facility 7 from the last 18 months. I want to see who knew what and when. She hung up before he could offer another excuse. The independent assessment took 4 days to arrange. 4 days during which Jace went about his ordinary life with the particular tension of a man who'd thrown a flare into the dark and had no idea if anyone had seen it. He picked up 2 smaller jobs through Dale's outfit, residential rewiring work that paid a fraction of what the facility contract had, and every night he checked his phone obsessively for a response that didn't come. On the 3rd night, Mia had one of her bad nights. He woke at 1 a.m. to the sound of her coughing through the monitor, a tight, wheezing cough that made his whole body go cold before he was even fully conscious. He was in her room in seconds, scooping her up, feeling her small body shudder against him, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Daddy," she managed between coughs. "Can't. I've got you. I've got you, baby. Breathe slow, just like we practiced." He grabbed her rescue inhaler from the nightstand, helped her use it with hands that were steadier than he felt, counted the breaths with her the way the pulmonologist had taught them both. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, until gradually, her breathing began to even out. He sat on the floor of her room with her curled against his chest for almost an hour. After that, long after her breathing had settled, long after she'd drifted back into an uneasy sleep, because he couldn't make himself put her down. Couldn't make himself stop feeling the rise and fall of her chest against his own. This was the thing nobody at Kensington Global understood when they looked at his report and saw an inconvenience, a budget problem, a contractor exaggerating for attention. This was what he was actually fighting for. Every time he took a dangerous job, every time he refused to let a corporation's convenience outweigh the truth. Not abstraction, not principle for its own sake. This. The exact weight of his daughter's body against his chest at 1 a.m, and the absolute certainty that he would do anything to keep her safe, including walking back into a building that everyone else was too afraid to enter. He thought about Facility 7 sitting out there in the dark, 40 minutes away, still running, still hiding its sickness behind a dashboard full of lies. And he wondered how many other people had someone waiting for them at home, someone whose safety depended on a system that men like Mercer had decided wasn't worth the inconvenience of fixing. The independent assessment team Aurora commissioned arrived at Facility 7 on a Tuesday morning. 3 engineers from a firm with no ties to Kensington Global, equipped with their own diagnostic equipment and explicit instructions to report directly to Aurora's office, bypassing the usual chain that ran through Holt's department. What they found, over the course of 2 days, confirmed everything Jace had documented and then went further. The bypass relay wasn't an isolated incident. It was one of 3 similar devices found throughout the facility's monitoring infrastructure, each one rerouting different categories of safety data to display falsely reassuring readings. The maintenance logs, when cross-referenced against actual purchase orders and parts inventory, revealed that critical cooling components, flagged for replacement 8 months earlier, had never actually been ordered. The alarm system hadn't been disabled for maintenance, as the sign at the gate claimed. It had been manually overridden and left that way for going on 5 months. Aurora read the preliminary findings alone in her office late on a Thursday night. The city lights spread out below her window and felt something that went beyond anger into a kind of cold, clarifying focus. She remembered from the early days of building her first company, the feeling of finally understanding the actual shape of a problem after weeks of being told it didn't exist. She thought about her father, who'd built this company from a single patent and a small team of engineers who actually cared about the work, who used to tell her that the worst kind of failure wasn't the one you didn't see coming. It was the one somebody saw coming and chose not to mention because the truth was inconvenient. He'd stepped down 8 months ago, officially for health reasons, though she'd always suspected the slow accumulation of corporate compromises he'd had to make in his final years as CEO had worn on him more than any illness. She wondered, with a discomfort she didn't enjoy sitting with, how many warnings like Jace Callahan's report had crossed her father's desk over the years and quietly disappeared into the same machinery of reassurance and deflection. She wasn't going to let that happen on her watch. She picked up her phone and called Holt again, this time not bothering with any preamble. The independent assessment confirms everything in Callahan's report, and worse, 3 falsified monitoring devices, not 1. Critical cooling components that were never replaced despite being flagged 8 months ago. An alarm system manually disabled for 5 months, not down for maintenance like the signage claims. I want to know who authorized that, Holt. I want a name. The silence on the other end of the line told her more than any answer could have. Aurora, I think we need to discuss this in person, with legal present, before. I don't want a meeting with legal. I want a name. Someone in this company decided it was cheaper to fake safety data than to actually fix a facility that's apparently been failing for the better part of a year. I want to know who made that decision, and I want to know tonight. It's not that simple. Decisions like facility maintenance prioritization go through multiple levels of operational review, budget committees, regional directors. Then give me the regional director's name. Another pause. Russell Mercer oversees that facility's operations. She wrote the name down, underlined it twice, and felt the particular satisfaction of finally having something solid to hold on to after weeks of vague unease and dismissive reassurances. I want him in my office tomorrow morning. And Holt, I want to know exactly how much you knew and when you knew it. Because right now, every report you've personally signed off on for the last year said this facility was fine. I need to understand whether that was negligence or something else. Aurora, I would never deliberately. I hope that's true, she said, and meant it, because despite everything, some part of her still wanted to believe her father's oldest colleague hadn't actively participated in bearing a disaster. But I need more than hope right now. I need answers. Tomorrow morning. She hung up and sat alone in her office for a long time afterward, looking out at the city, thinking about a contractor she'd never met who'd walked into a building everyone else refused to enter, found a disaster everyone else had been paid to ignore, and sent her the truth anyway, with nothing to gain from it except the satisfaction of having done the right thing. She pulled up his email again and read his 3 short paragraphs one more time, the plain, unembellished language of a man who clearly wasn't used to being listened to and had written anyway, on the chance that someone, somewhere up the chain, might actually care. Someone needs to act on this before it becomes something nobody can fix, he'd written at the end. I have a daughter at home. I don't know the people who work inside that data center, but I'd want someone to do this for her if our positions were reversed. She read that line 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and, against every instinct her executive assistant would have warned her against, dialed the number listed at the bottom of his email directly. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice rough with sleep, the particular thickness of someone woken in the middle of the night who answered anyway because some part of him had been waiting for exactly this call. Hello? Mr. Callahan, my name is Aurora Kensington. I'm sorry to call so late. I read your report. The silence on his end lasted just long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. You actually read it, he said finally, and there was something in his voice, not relief exactly, not yet, but the cautious beginning of it, the sound of a man who'd spent days bracing for silence and was still adjusting to being heard. I read it 3 times, Aurora said, and I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Callahan. What my independent assessment team found out there is worse than what you reported. Not because you missed anything, because you only had 1 night and they had 2 days with full access. How much worse? 3 falsified monitoring devices instead of 1. Critical components that were flagged for replacement 8 months ago and never ordered. An alarm system that's been manually disabled for 5 months, not for maintenance like the sign at the gate claims. She heard him exhale slowly on the other end, the sound of a man absorbing confirmation of something he'd already feared. 5 months? He repeated. That building's been 1 bad night away from a real disaster for 5 months, and nobody upstairs. I know. Aurora's voice was quiet now, stripped of the corporate polish she usually maintained even in difficult conversations. I'm trying to understand how that happened under my own company's roof, with my own executives signing off on reports that said everything was fine. I owe you an apology, Mr. Callahan. You walked into that building, did your job for 1 night, and found problems that should have been caught by people I'm paying significantly more than I ever paid you. I didn't call your office hoping for an apology. I know that too, but you're getting one anyway because it's true and because you earned it. She paused, looking out at the dark skyline, thinking about the clock Jace had described, the one he couldn't see but knew was running. I'm shutting that facility down. Effective immediately, full power transfer to backup infrastructure, complete safety overhaul before it ever comes back online. I wanted you to be the first person outside my own team to know, because you're the reason I know it all. There was a long pause on his end, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that hadn't been there before. Not quite trust, not yet, but the careful, hard-won beginning of it. Thank you, he said simply, for listening. Thank you for not giving up when it would have been easier to, Aurora said. I have a feeling this isn't over, Mr. Callahan. Whoever signed off on those falsified reports, whoever decided it was cheaper to disable an alarm system than fix what was actually wrong, that person is still inside my company, and I intend to find out exactly who they are. For what it's worth, Jace said, be careful. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had over a year to cover their tracks. People who go to that much trouble to hide something don't usually stop just because somebody finally noticed. I appreciate the warning, Aurora said, echoing, without either of them realizing it, almost the exact words Lonnie the security guard had offered Jace 4 nights earlier. I'll be in touch, Mr. Callahan. I don't think this is the last conversation we're going to have. She hung up the phone and sat alone in her office a while longer. The city spread out below her, and somewhere out past the edge of the skyline, in the dark, Facility 7 kept humming, kept running, kept holding its quiet catastrophe just barely in check, waiting for a shutdown order that, despite Aurora's promise, hadn't actually been signed yet, caught somewhere in the slow machinery of corporate process, in the careful hands of people who had every reason to make sure it never reached the facility in time. The shutdown order sat on Russell Mercer's desk for 2 full days before he did anything with it at all. He'd read it the morning after Aurora's call to Jace, a clean, direct memo from the CEO's office. Facility 7 to be powered down and transferred to backup infrastructure effective immediately, pending full safety remediation. He'd read it twice, the way Jace had read his contract offer, the way Aurora had read Jace's email. Except where those readings had each led toward action, Mercer's reading led him somewhere else entirely, toward the calculator app on his phone, toward a spreadsheet he kept for exactly this kind of contingency, toward the cold arithmetic of what an immediate shutdown would actually cost. 23 client contracts depended on that backup capacity. A full transfer to alternate infrastructure, done properly, with the redundancy testing it required, would take weeks, not the hours Aurora's memo seemed to assume. Done improperly, rushed to satisfy a CEO who'd apparently developed an attack of conscience over a contractor's overnight report, it risked outages that would trigger penalty clauses worth more than Mercer's entire division budget. He called Holt Renfield instead of executing the order. "She doesn't understand the operational reality," Mercer said, pacing his office, phone pressed to his ear. "You can't just flip a switch on infrastructure this size. We need a transition plan, client notifications, a window where we're not exposed to liability." "I know that, Russell. I've been trying to explain operational complexity to Aurora since she walked into this building 8 months ago, and she hears it as excuses every single time." Holt's voice carried its own particular strain, the sound of a man caught between the daughter of his old friend and the machinery he'd spent 2 decades helping build. "She wants this shut down. She's not going to back off it." "Then we do it right, on a real timeline. Not the fantasy one she's imagining. 2 weeks. Maybe 10 days if we push hard. That's not me dragging my feet. That's just physics." "Tell her that yourself." "I will. But in the meantime, that facility doesn't need to go fully dark today. We can reduce load, pull some of the affected battery banks offline, buy ourselves the runway to do this properly." It was on its surface a reasonable-sounding compromise, the kind of measured operational language that had carried Mercer through 15 years of corporate advancement. And if he'd actually meant it, if he'd actually pulled the affected banks offline, actually reduced load to a genuinely safe level, the next 72 hours might have unfolded very differently. He didn't. He reduced load on paper, updated the dashboard readings to reflect a partial power down that never physically occurred, and left the facility running at nearly full capacity while he worked the phones trying to convince Aurora, through Holt, that an immediate hard shutdown was operationally reckless. He told himself he was buying time to do this the right way. What he was actually doing, underneath the language he used to justify it to himself, was protecting 18 months of his own decisions from the kind of scrutiny that would follow if the full picture ever became fully public. Decisions that traced back page by page, log entry by log entry, directly to him. Aurora, 40 floors above and trusting that her direct order had been executed, moved on to the next item on a list that had grown considerably longer since Jace's email first landed in her inbox. She didn't check the facility's live status herself. She had no reason, yet, not to trust that an order this explicit had been carried out. The battery network kept running. The bypass relays kept feeding their calm, false numbers to a monitoring system that no longer reflected anything close to reality. And somewhere in the heart of that dark building, in a section of racks that had been quietly cooking for 5 months under a disabled alarm system, the heat kept climbing, cell by cell, past the point where any amount of corporate maneuvering was going to matter. Jace didn't know any of this when his phone rang at 2:51 a.m. 3 nights later. He'd just gotten Mia back down after a smaller cough, nothing like the bad night from before, and he was standing in his dark kitchen drinking water straight from the tap when the screen lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. Then some instinct, the same one that had told him to check the bypass relay behind that service panel, made him pick up. "Callahan." "Mr. Callahan, this is Denise Whitfield. Security, Facility 7. Her voice was tight, fast, stripped of the careful composure she'd had the night they'd talked in the corridor. "I know it's late. I know your contract ended. But I need you to listen to me right now." He was already moving, grabbing his boots from beside the door. "Talk to me." "Something's wrong down there, more wrong than usual. I did my 2 a.m. round past the stairwell to sub-level 2 and the whole corridor was hot, mister." Callahan, hot like an oven, and there's a smell now, electrical, like something's burning slow. I called dispatch, I called the emergency line, I called Mercer's office direct line and got voicemail. Nobody's picking up. Did you pull the manual fire alarm? It's disabled, remember? Whole system's been down for months. I don't even have that option. Jace's mind ran through the layout of that battery room with the same cold clarity it had run through compound layouts in Helmand, mapping distance, mapping risk, mapping what 15% of overheating cells in close proximity actually meant once they crossed from warning sign into active failure. Denise, listen to me very carefully. Get out of that building right now. Don't go check it again. Don't try to handle it yourself. Get to the gate, get Lonnie, and get clear of the structure entirely. What about you? I'm 20 minutes out. I'm coming. Mr. Callahan, your contract's done. You don't have to... I know what I have to do, he said, already pulling on his boots one-handed, phone wedged against his shoulder. Get clear. I'll call you when I'm close. He hung up and stood in his dark kitchen for 1 second, looking down the hallway toward Mia's room, toward the soft rectangle of her nightlight glowing under the door. Renee's number was already pulled up on his phone before he'd consciously decided to call it. Jace, it's 3 a.m. What? I need you to come watch Mia. Right now. I know it's a horrible thing to ask, I know, but I don't have anyone else and I have to go. Something in his voice must have told her everything she needed to know, because she didn't argue, didn't ask the obvious questions about why a man whose contract had already ended was rushing out the door at 3 a.m. toward a building he'd spent 4 hours warning everyone about. I'm coming, she said. 10 minutes. Go. No. The drive out to Facility 7 took 18 minutes instead of the usual 40, Jace pushing his old truck harder than he probably should have, on roads barely lit by anything but his own headlights, his mind running through every contingency, every piece of equipment he might need, every protocol he remembered from training exercises that had nothing to do with industrial batteries and everything to do with operating decisively inside a deteriorating situation with limited information and no backup. He could see the glow before he reached the gate. Not fire, not yet, but a strange orange wash visible through the high windows of the building, the unmistakable signature of something running far hotter than any climate-controlled facility should ever be. Lonnie and Denise were standing well clear of the fence line when he pulled up, both of them looking shaken in the particular way people looked when they'd just watched something become real that they'd spent months being told wasn't a genuine threat. Thank God you're here, Lonnie said, and Jace didn't correct him, didn't have the time or the inclination to explain that he didn't believe in the sentiment behind the words, even as he understood the relief driving them. I called everyone. Emergency line, corporate, the fire department non-emergency number, since I wasn't sure if 911 would even... You should call 911 now, Jace said, already moving toward his truck bed where he kept a secondary toolkit, heavier gear, the things he never used on residential jobs but had learned, over 4 years in the trade, never to leave behind on anything industrial. Tell them thermal event, large-scale battery storage facility, possible chemical fire risk. Get them rolling even if it takes them a while to get out here. What are you doing? Denise's voice climbed somewhere between confusion and alarm. Watching him pull on heavy gloves, a respirator, check the charge on his thermal camera. You're not seriously going back in there. If that cascade isn't isolated in the next few minutes, it's not going to stay contained to sub-level 2. You said yourself this building sits 40 minutes outside response time for real fire suppression equipment. By the time anyone gets here with the resources to handle a battery fire of this scale, that whole corridor is going to be gone, and depending on what's stored adjacent to it, maybe a lot more than that. It's not your job anymore, Lonnie said. You don't work here. Your contract's done. Nobody's going to blame you for staying out here. I'll blame myself. Jace checked the respirator seal, the simple, flat statement carrying more weight than any explanation could have. I knew this was coming. I told Mercer myself 4 days ago, and he told me to have a good day. If I stand out here and watch this building burn because some executive decided it wasn't worth the inconvenience to actually fix what I found, that's on me too, not just them. He called Aurora as he moved toward the gate, not entirely sure why, except that some instinct told him she needed to know in real time, not through a sanitized report filtered through 3 layers of management trying to manage their own exposure before they managed the actual crisis. She picked up on the second ring, her voice immediately sharp with alertness despite the hour. "Mr. Callahan? Facility 7 is an active thermal cascade. I'm here now, on site." "Your shutdown order didn't happen, Ms. Kensington. That building's still running full load." There was a silence on the line that lasted maybe 2 seconds and carried in that brief span the sound of someone's entire understanding of her own company rearranging itself. "That's not possible. I signed that order myself 4 days ago." "Then somebody between your office and that facility decided not to execute it. I don't have time to figure out who right now. I need you to call whoever has actual authority to greenlight emergency response resources. And I need you to understand that I'm about to go in there and try to keep this from becoming a total loss because nobody else currently capable of doing that is in a position to act fast enough." Jace. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and something in the shift carried its own kind of weight. "Don't. Wait for fire response. Wait for—" "There's no time to wait, Ms. Kensington. I've been here before, just not with batteries instead of bullets. I know how to do this." He was already pushing through the gate, Denise's protests and Lonnie's white-faced silence behind him. "Tell whoever you need to tell. I'll call you when I'm out." He hung up before she could argue further, because arguing further was a luxury that belonged to a different kind of crisis, one with more time built into it. The corridor leading to the stairwell was already thick with a haze that stung his eyes even through the respirator's partial seal. The air carrying that distinct, acrid smell of overheating electronics pushed past every safe limit, something chemical and wrong underneath it that made his lungs want to reject every breath. Emergency lighting flickered, some fixtures already dead, the building's ordinary systems beginning to fail under whatever load the cascade was placing on the electrical infrastructure surrounding it. He took the stairs down 2 at a time, thermal camera in one hand, the heat radiating up through the stairwell increasing with every step, until by the time he reached the sublevel 2 door, the metal handle itself felt warm even through his glove. He opened it onto something close to hell. The far end of the battery room, the section he'd flagged 5 nights earlier, glowed with a dull orange light that had no business existing inside a climate-controlled facility, the unmistakable visual signature of a chain reaction that had moved past the point of subtle thermal anomalies into active, visible failure. Smoke curled along the ceiling in slow, heavy waves. Somewhere in that section, cells were venting, the high-pitched hiss of pressure release audible even over the building's failing HVAC system, each hiss a small countdown toward the cells around it reaching their own breaking point. His training took over in a way that felt almost separate from conscious thought, the same mechanism that had once let him move through compound clearances with his heart rate steady while everything around him screamed for panic. He scanned the room fast, cataloging exits, cataloging the location of the main electrical disconnects, cataloging which racks were still cool enough to approach safely, and which had already crossed past any point where a man without full hazmat gear should get near them. The main isolation switch for that battery cluster sat on a panel near the room's center, close enough to the failing section that approaching it meant walking directly into the worst of the heat and smoke, but far enough from the cells actively venting that it wasn't, yet, an outright suicide mission. He moved. The heat hit him in a wall about 15 feet from the panel, a physical pressure against his exposed skin, even through his protective gear, sweat instantly soaking through his shirt beneath the heavy jacket he'd grabbed from his truck. He kept his breathing controlled, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the same rhythm he'd taught Mia during her asthma attacks. Strange to think of even now, in the middle of this, his daughter's small chest rising and falling against his own training, how he survived everything else. He reached the panel and threw open the access cover with hands that had gone slick inside his gloves. The isolation switches were laid out exactly as the old installation specs he'd found in that supply closet had described, 3 banks of breakers controlling power flow to and from each major battery cluster. He found the bank corresponding to the failing section and began isolating it methodically, cutting the connection that would allow the thermal runaway to keep drawing power and feeding its own destruction, fighting the urge to rush, because rushing was how you flipped the wrong switch and made everything worse instead of better. A voice crackled through his earpiece. Lonnie, patched through on the radio Denise had shoved into his hands before he went in, his voice tight with fear. "Jace, you copy? Fire department's 20 minutes out, minimum. They're coming from the county station, nearest one with the right equipment. Copy. Working the isolation now. Jace's voice came out steady despite everything, the old discipline holding even as sweat ran into his eyes and the heat pressed against him like a living thing. I need eyes on the ventilation system if you can access it remotely. The HVAC's failing, and I need the emergency exhaust fans running, or this smoke's going to fill the whole sublevel. On it, Denise's voice cut in, breathless. There's a manual override in the security office. Give me 60 seconds. He finished isolating the first bank, watched the venting in that section ease, just slightly. The worst of the immediate energy feed cut off even as the cells that had already reached critical temperature continued their own internal reaction, unstoppable now except by time and isolation from anything that might let it spread further. He moved toward the second bank, the one feeding the cluster directly adjacent to the failing section, the one that, if it went next, would turn a contained disaster into something the whole building, and possibly the data center campus beyond it, might not survive. That was when the explosion hit. Not a massive detonation, nothing like that, not yet, but a sharp, violent pop from somewhere in the failing section, a cell or cluster of cells finally rupturing past containment, sending a wave of superheated gas and chemical fire rolling outward in a burst that knocked Jace sideways into a support column hard enough to crack something in his ribs and send white-hot pain lancing up his side. He felt heat scorch across his forearm where his sleeve had ridden up, felt it through the glove on his right hand where the material had melted slightly against his skin, and somewhere in the chaos he registered, with the flat clarity of a man too deep in crisis to fully process pain, yet that he'd just been burned. Jace! Denise's voice, sharp with panic, crackling through the radio. What was that? Are you... I'm up. He pushed himself off the column, ignoring the grinding pain in his ribs, ignoring the burn screaming along his forearm, because stopping now meant the second bank stayed live, meant the cluster beside it kept feeding the cascade instead of starving it. Ventilation. Status. Online. Exhaust fans running. Give it a minute to clear some of that smoke. He could already feel the difference. A faint pull of air moving past him toward the exhaust vents. Not enough yet, not nearly enough, but something. He made it to the second isolation bank on legs that didn't feel entirely steady anymore, his vision swimming slightly at the edges from smoke inhalation despite the respirator, and forced his hands to move with the same deliberate precision they'd used on the first bank, because sloppy work here didn't just risk failure, it risked killing him outright. He cut the second bank, watched the venting in the adjacent cluster slow, then stop, felt, for the first time since he'd walked through that door, something that might have been the beginning of control returning to a situation that had, 20 minutes earlier, been in full, unrestrained collapse. It wasn't over. The original failing section was still burning, still venting, the cells that had already crossed critical threshold continuing their reaction regardless of what power he cut. Because thermal runaway, once truly begun, ran its own course until the fuel driving it was exhausted. But it was contained now, isolated from the rest of the network, no longer capable of spreading into a cascade that could have taken down the entire battery storage system, and with it, the structural integrity of everything built around it. He keyed the radio, his voice rougher now, breath coming harder than he wanted to admit. Cascades isolated, original sections still burning, contained for now. I need that fire crew the second they're on site, and I need someone to know there's flammable off-gassing in here, so brief them before they go in heavy. Copy that. Lonnie's voice shaking with relief. Jace, get out of there. Please, you did it. Get out. He almost listened. He almost turned right then and walked back toward the stairwell and the cooler air and the night sky outside, his job functionally done. The immediate catastrophe averted by his own hands in a way nobody could argue with later. Instead, he stood there a moment longer, looking at the supply closet across the room where he'd found those falsified maintenance logs 5 nights earlier, and thought about Mercer's face across that desk. Thought about, I'll forward your report to engineering for review when it's appropriate. Thought about a shutdown order Aurora had told him she'd personally signed that had somehow, conveniently, never actually been executed. He thought about the fact that once the fire department arrived, once this became an official incident with official investigators, There would be a very narrow window where the people responsible for this could still get into that supply closet, still access that monitoring terminal, still scrub away the evidence before anyone outside the company had a chance to see it in its original, unaltered state. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, hands trembling slightly now from adrenaline crash and the burn along his forearm, and began photographing everything one more time. The monitoring dashboard still displaying its calm, false readings even now, even with smoke thick in the air around it, a screen lying to anyone who looked at it about a disaster that had just nearly destroyed the building it claimed to be protecting. The bypass relays still wired in exactly as he'd found them. The isolation panel he'd just used, time-stamped photographs proving he'd manually intervened because no automated system had been capable of doing it for him. He grabbed the maintenance log binder from the supply closet, the one he'd photographed before but hadn't taken physical possession of, and tucked it inside his jacket, because copies could be disputed, could be claimed as taken out of context, but the original physical evidence was harder to argue away. Only then did he turn and make his way back toward the stairwell, each step sending fresh pain through his cracked ribs, his burned arm throbbing in time with his pulse, the adrenaline that had carried him through the worst of it finally beginning to ebb and leave the actual cost of what he'd just done in its wake. He emerged from the building into a night that had transformed entirely in the time he'd been inside. Emergency vehicles pulling through the gate, lights strobing red and blue against the dark fields beyond the fence. Firefighters already gearing up to move in with equipment built for exactly this kind of chemical fire that he'd had none of. Denise reached him first, her face going pale at the sight of him up close, the burn visible now along his forearm, the way he was holding his ribs with his uninjured hand. "You're hurt. Jace, you're really hurt." "I'm fine." He wasn't, not really, but he'd learned a long time ago what a man could keep walking through when the alternative was sitting down and letting the pain win. "Where's the lead on scene? I need to brief them on the layout before they go in, what's isolated, what's still active, what gas hazards they're walking into." He spent the next 20 minutes doing exactly that, standing at the gate with a county fire captain who kept glancing at his burned arm with obvious concern, even as he absorbed every detail Jace gave him about the room's layout. The isolation work already completed, the specific section still actively burning, and what it would take to fully extinguish it without making things worse. It was only after the fire crews had moved in, after the immediate adrenaline of briefing them had passed, that the full weight of the night finally caught up with him, and he sat down hard on the bumper of his truck, breathing through the pain in his ribs, the burn on his arm finally registering as the kind of injury that needed real medical attention, rather than just willpower to push through. His phone rang. Aurora. "Jace, tell me you're all right." "I'm alive, banged up." Cascade's isolated, fire department's working the rest now. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion crashing over him in a wave. "Your shutdown order never reached the facility, Ms. Kensington. Whoever's running operations here decided to override it. I don't know who yet, but the evidence is going to point somewhere specific once people start actually looking." There was a long silence on the line, and when Aurora spoke again, her voice had a different quality to it than he'd heard before. Not the careful composure of an executive managing a crisis from a distance, but something rawer, more personal. "I'm coming there," she said. "Tonight. Right now. Miss Kensington, it's almost 4 in the morning, and this is going to be a scene full of fire crews, and I don't care. A man nearly died tonight inside a building my company owns, fixing a problem my own people were told about and chose to ignore. I'm not managing this from a desk 40 minutes away while you sit in a parking lot bleeding because of decisions my executives made." Her voice carried a steel he hadn't heard from her before, even in their first phone call. "I'll be there within the hour." He didn't argue. He sat on the bumper of his truck, watching the strobing lights of fire equipment against the dark sky. The building behind him finally, slowly, surrendering its fire to people equipped to actually fight it, and thought, with the particular exhausted clarity that came after surviving something he probably shouldn't have, about Mia asleep at home, about Renee sitting up waiting for news, about how close tonight had come to a very different kind of phone call reaching his sister's house, instead of the one that eventually would. He'd done what needed doing. He'd survived it. And somewhere out there, on roads still dark before the coming dawn, a A woman who controlled one of the largest technology companies in the country was driving toward him with a fury that had nothing to do with liability or public relations and everything to do with the truth she could no longer pretend not to see. She found him exactly where she expected, sitting on the bumper of a beat-up truck at the edge of a chaotic scene, fire crews still working the building behind him, paramedics finally getting him to sit still long enough to wrap his burned forearm while he argued, even now, that he was fine. Aurora got out of her car before the driver had fully stopped it and walked straight past two of her own corporate security men who'd arrived ahead of her, past a county fire captain who tried to brief her on containment status, straight to the man sitting bloodied and exhausted in the strobing light. "Mr. Callahan." He looked up, and whatever he'd expected, a CEO arriving for a liability assessment, a damage control performance. It clearly wasn't what he found in her face instead. Something closer to genuine fear that had only just started loosening its grip. "Miss Kensington, you didn't need to come out here." "I told you I was coming." She crouched down slightly to his eye level, taking in the burn the paramedic was wrapping, the way he held his ribs, the soot still streaked across his jaw. "How bad is it?" "Second-degree burn on the forearm, couple cracked ribs from getting thrown into a support column. I'll live." He said it the way men who'd survived worse things said it, flat and unbothered, the kind of understatement that told her more about what he'd actually walked through than any detailed account would have. "Cascade's fully contained now. Fire crews mopping up what's left in that one section. Rest of the battery network's isolated and cold. You shouldn't have gone in there alone." "There wasn't anyone else to go in with me." He met her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "Your shutdown order didn't happen, Ms. Kensington. I told you that already. Somebody between your desk and that building decided 4 days wasn't worth losing client contracts over." "I know." Her jaw tightened, the fury she'd been driving with finally finding somewhere to land. "I'm going to find out exactly who and exactly why, starting tonight." The paramedic finished wrapping his arm and started in on a recommendation that Jace go to the hospital for proper evaluation of his ribs, and Jace started in on his usual refusal, the stubborn deflection of a man unused to being fussed over, and Aurora cut across both of them with a tone that brooked no argument. "You're going to the hospital, tonight. I'll have someone drive you myself if you fight me on it." When he opened his mouth to protest, she kept going. "You have a daughter, Mr. Callahan. I read that line in your email more times than I probably should have. She needs her father whole, not stubbornly refusing an x-ray because he's too proud to admit he might have internal injuries." That landed in a way her authority as CEO clearly hadn't, and something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, the fight going out of him. "Fine," he said. "Hospital, but I want copies of everything I documented tonight in safe hands before I go anywhere. The original maintenance log binder's in my truck. Photos are backed up to my personal email and a cloud drive, but I want you to have the physical evidence directly, not filtered through whoever's been managing your reports on this facility so far." "Give it to me," Aurora said. "Personally. Not through Holt, not through Mercer, not through anyone else in this company until I understand exactly who's responsible." He retrieved the binder from his truck, wincing with the movement, and handed it to her along with a small flash drive he pulled from his jacket pocket. "Everything's on there too, time-stamped, organized. Should hold up to whatever kind of investigation you're planning." She took it from him with both hands, feeling the weight of it, 14 months of falsified entries that had nearly cost a man his life tonight, and looked up at him with something that had shifted somewhere in the last several minutes, from corporate obligation into something more personal. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not the kind of thank you Mercer probably gave you, the real kind. I didn't do it for thanks." He let one of the paramedics finally guide him toward the ambulance, then paused, looking back at her. "I did it because somebody had to, and apparently nobody inside your company was willing." He let Renee drive him home from the hospital just before 7 that morning, his ribs taped, his arm properly dressed, a bottle of prescription pain medication he had no intention of actually taking sitting in the cup holder between them, because pain medication made him groggy, and groggy wasn't a state he could afford with Mia needing him in a few hours. "You look like you went 3 rounds with something that won," Renee said, glancing over at him as she pulled into his driveway. "Feels about right." "Mia's been asking for you all night. I told her you were working." Renee's expression carried the particular weight of a sister who'd spent the last several hours imagining a much worse phone call than the one she'd eventually received. Jace, you can't keep doing this. Not to yourself, and not to her. What happens if next time it's not just a couple cracked ribs? There's not going to be a next time like that one. He said it with more confidence than he entirely felt, but it was true enough in its specific way. There wasn't another Facility 7 sitting on the immediate horizon, no other building he'd already committed to walking into. I'm done with that place. Whatever happens next happens between Aurora Kensington and her own executives. Aurora Kensington, Renee repeated, something curious in her tone. The CEO drove out to a fire scene at 4 in the morning to personally check on you? She takes this seriously, more seriously than I expected, honestly. Renee studied him for a moment longer than the comment warranted, but didn't push it, and Jace let himself off the hook from examining too closely why the memory of Aurora crouching down to his eye level, asking how bad is it like she actually wanted to know the real answer, had settled somewhere in his chest that didn't quite match the simple transactional relationship he'd assumed they had when he first sent that email 5 days ago. Mia was awake when he's walked in, sitting at the kitchen table in her school clothes, and the sight of her small face crumpling with worry when she saw the bandage on his arm hit him harder than anything from the night before had managed to. Daddy, what happened? She was up out of her chair immediately, careful in a way that told him she somehow already understood, instinctively not to throw her full weight against him. I'm okay, baby girl. Got a little burned at work, that's all. Looks worse than it feels. He crouched down carefully, mindful of his ribs, and let her examine the bandage with the serious concentration she gave everything that worried her. I promise you, I'm fine. You should be more careful, she said, with the particular gravity 6-year-olds sometimes managed when repeating back, almost verbatim, things adults had said to them. And Jace felt something tighten in his chest at hearing his own daughter echo a sentiment that, coming from her, somehow cut deeper than it had from Renee, or the paramedic or anyone else. I will be, he told her, and meant it as much as a man in his line of work honestly could. Aurora arrived at the executive offices that morning on almost no sleep, the binder of falsified maintenance logs sitting on the passenger seat of her car, the whole drive in, and walked into a building that had no idea yet how thoroughly its quiet arrangement of comfortable lies was about to come apart. She called an emergency meeting of her senior leadership for 9 a.m. Gave Priya explicit instructions that Russell Mercer was to be present in person, not by phone, and spent the intervening hour reading through the independent assessment team's full findings one more time, cross-referencing them line by line against the binder Jace had handed her at 4:30 that morning. The pattern, once she traced it fully, was damning in a way that left little room for the kind of plausible deniability executives usually relied on. Every falsified maintenance entry traced back to authorization codes tied to Mercer's regional office. Every purchase order for replacement cooling components that had never actually been ordered showed Mercer's digital signature on the cancellation. The alarm system override, the one Denise had described as disabled for 5 months under the cover story of routine maintenance, that authorization, too, ran back to a code only Mercer's office had access to issue. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences or operational oversights that might generously be attributed to negligence rather than intent. It was a paper trail, 14 months long, showing one man systematically prioritizing cost savings and decommission timelines over the actual safety of a facility he was responsible for overseeing. Holt arrived first, looking like a man who'd aged a decade since their phone call 3 nights earlier, and sat down across from her with none of his usual easy confidence. Aurora, before this meeting starts, I need you to understand, I'll hear what you need to say once everyone's here, she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for the kind of private appeal he was clearly hoping to make. I want this conversation on the record, with everyone who needs to hear it present at once. Mercer arrived 12 minutes later, and Aurora watched his face as he walked in, watched him take in the binder sitting open on the conference table, the printed photographs spread beside it, the independent assessment report stacked at her elbow. Something flickered across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but she'd spent enough years reading rooms full of people trying to hide things to recognize it for exactly what it was. Fear. "Russell," she said, once the rest of her senior team had settled into their seats, "I want to walk through something with everyone present." She laid it out methodically, the way Jace had laid out his findings to Mercer 5 days earlier, except this time with the full weight of an independent investigation behind every claim, the way each falsified entry traced directly back to authorization codes belonging to his office, the way the alarm override that had nearly cost a man his life. The night before could be traced, signature by signature, to decisions made under his direct authority. "I have a contractor in the hospital this morning with a second-degree burn and cracked ribs," she said, her voice level but carrying an edge that hadn't been there in any previous meeting in this room. "Because he walked into a building alone at 3 a.m. to manually isolate a thermal cascade that an automated system should have flagged 5 months ago, if that system hadn't been deliberately disabled. I want to understand, Russell, in your own words, why that happened." Mercer's composure, the same easy corporate confidence he'd worn across his desk when he told Jace to have a good day, cracked visibly now, his hands tightening on the table's edge. "Aurora, you have to understand the position I was in. That facility's decommission timeline, the client contracts riding on uninterrupted backup capacity, the budget constraints from 3 different directions. That's not an answer to my question. I asked why a maintenance log was falsified for 14 months. I asked why an alarm system was manually disabled and then disguised behind a maintenance sign at the gate. Those aren't budget decisions, Russell. Those are deliberate acts of concealment. I was managing risk the way I've always managed risk in that role. I made a judgment call that the facility could continue operating safely with reduced monitoring while we worked toward decommission. A judgment call." Aurora's voice stayed quiet, but something underneath it had gone very cold. "You disabled the alarm system that would have flagged tonight's cascade 5 months before it happened. You falsified 14 months of maintenance records to hide the fact that critical cooling components were never replaced. And 4 days ago, when I personally signed an order to shut that facility down immediately, you didn't execute it. You told Holt you were reducing load while the facility continued running at near full capacity. That's not risk management, Russell. That's fraud, and it's the reason a man is sitting in a hospital bed this morning instead of going to work." Mercer's face had gone pale, the careful corporate language finally abandoning him entirely. "I want legal counsel present before I say anything further." "You're welcome to have legal counsel," Aurora said. "But understand this. As of this moment, you're suspended from your role pending a full board investigation. Security will escort you to collect personal items, and you will not have access to any facility systems, financial records, or company communications during that process." The rest of the room sat in a heavy, stunned silence as 2 security personnel Aurora had quietly arranged to be standing by entered to escort Mercer out, his protests trailing behind him down the hallway, the same hallway where, 5 days earlier, he'd told a contractor that his contract was complete and he'd be paid in full. Once the door closed behind them, Aurora turned to Holt, who looked like a man bracing for his own version of the same conversation. "I need to know what you knew," she said. "Not what you suspected, not what felt off to you. What you actually knew, and when." "Aurora, I swear to you, I never saw the falsified logs directly. I trusted Russell's quarterly summaries the same way I'd trusted every regional director's summaries for years. That's how this company has always operated." "Then maybe that's part of the problem." Her voice carried genuine disappointment now, the particular kind reserved for someone she'd wanted, despite everything, to believe in. "You signed off on reports calling that facility fine for 4 consecutive quarters, Holt. You told me directly that the facility's age made it inherently stable. You discouraged my request for a site visit for 6 weeks. I'm not accusing you of falsifying records yourself, but I'm telling you that the culture that let this happen, the culture where nobody above a regional director actually verifies what they're being told, where convenient numbers get accepted without question because questioning them is inconvenient, that culture exists because leadership, including you, allowed it to exist." Holt didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't a good one, and the silence that followed carried its own kind of verdict. What? The board investigation convened 8 days later in a conference room considerably more formal than the one where Aurora had confronted Mercer, with outside counsel present, a court reporter transcribing every word, and the full weight of Kensington Global's board of directors arrayed around a long table, Several of them men who'd known Aurora's father for decades and had spent the last 8 months quietly wondering whether his daughter was truly capable of running what he'd built. Jace sat at the far end of the table, his arms still wrapped, though the bandage was smaller now, his ribs healing enough that he'd stopped wincing every time he shifted in his chair. Denise sat beside him, having agreed to testify about what she'd witnessed over her 2 years working security at the facility. Aurora sat at the head of the table, the binder of falsified maintenance logs, the independent assessment report, and a thick file of supporting evidence stacked in front of her. Mercer's attorney made the expected arguments first, that the facility's age justified certain operational shortcuts, that the contractor in question was not a qualified engineer and had potentially misread or exaggerated his findings, that the company's internal processes, while perhaps imperfect, didn't rise to the level of deliberate fraud the investigation seemed to be alleging. Jace was called to testify just before the lunch recess, and he answered every question with the same plain, unembellished directness that had characterized his original email, walking the board through exactly what he'd found his first night in that facility, the thermal readings that contradicted the dashboard, the bypass relay he'd discovered behind the service panel, the pattern of falsified maintenance entries he'd photographed page by page. Mr. Callahan, one of the board members, an older woman named Eleanor Voss who'd served on Kensington's board for over a decade, asked, "You're not a licensed engineer. How can you be certain your interpretation of these readings was accurate, rather than a misunderstanding of equipment you weren't fully trained to evaluate?" "I'm a licensed electrician with 4 years in industrial work," Jace said evenly. "I don't need an engineering degree to recognize a thermal camera reading 94 degrees in a section a dashboard claims is 68. That's not a matter of interpretation, ma'am. That's a contradiction between what a sensor is actually measuring and what a screen is telling people to believe. The independent assessment your own company commissioned confirmed everything I found, in greater detail than I had access to in one night. And the Cascade event 3 nights later. You entered the facility despite having no further contractual obligation to do so. Why?" Jace was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same care he'd given every answer so far. "Because security called me at 3 in the morning, scared, with nobody else picking up, and I knew what was in that room. I knew what it meant if nobody acted fast enough. I've got a daughter at home who depends on me, ma'am, and I thought about her the whole drive out there. But I also thought about whoever was supposed to be safely powered by that facility, employees, clients, people who had no idea their safety depended on a system somebody had deliberately broken to save money. I didn't see another option that let me live with myself afterward." Eleanor Voss studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her previously skeptical expression. "That's a remarkably selfless answer for a man who had every reason to walk away. I spent 8 years in the Navy learning that walking away when somebody needs you isn't really an option. I know how to choose, ma'am. Old habits." Denise's testimony followed, corroborating the timeline, the disabled alarm system, the pattern of contractors emerging from the building shaken and unwilling to discuss what they'd seen, the maintenance trucks that had come and gone off the books over the past year without proper documentation, the facility's original security director, a man who'd retired 18 months earlier and had been tracked down by Aurora's investigators, provided written testimony confirming that the alarm system had been fully functional and regularly tested throughout his tenure, directly contradicting Mercer's claim that the system had inherent reliability issues justifying its disablement. By the time the board recessed for the day, the cumulative weight of evidence, Jace's documentation, the independent assessment, Denise's testimony, the falsified authorization codes traced directly to Mercer's office, the original system logs the security director had preserved on his own initiative years earlier, had assembled into something no amount of legal maneuvering could meaningfully dispute. The board's findings were delivered 6 days later. Russell Mercer was formally terminated for cause, with the board's report explicitly citing deliberate falsification of safety records and willful endangerment of personnel. The legal team began the process of determining whether the evidence warranted referral to outside authorities for further investigation, a question that, as far as Jace was concerned, had an obvious answer, though he understood it wasn't his decision to make. Holt Renfield was not terminated, but the board mandated a complete restructuring of operational oversight, removing his authority over regional facility management and instituting a new system requiring independent safety audits, conducted by outside firms with no financial relationship to Kensington Global on a quarterly basis going forward. It wasn't the outcome Jace would have chosen. Watching a man who'd at minimum been catastrophically negligent retain his position in some diminished form, but Aurora had explained her reasoning to him afterward with the kind of honesty that had, over these past weeks, become characteristic of how she dealt with him. "I don't think Holt deliberately falsified anything," she'd said, the two of them sitting in her office on a late afternoon, the city spread out gold and orange beneath a setting sun. "I think he built a career on trusting people he shouldn't have trusted, and on a culture that rewarded comfortable answers over difficult questions. That's a real failure. It's just a different kind of failure than Russell's. I have to decide what kind of company I'm building going forward, and removing every flawed person isn't the same as building something better. Sometimes it's about making sure the same mistake can't happen again, structurally, regardless of who's sitting in which chair." Jace had thought about that for a while, about the particular wisdom in it, the recognition that some failures came from malice, and others from a kind of comfortable cowardice that was its own distinct problem requiring its own distinct solution. "That's a more generous read than I'd have given him," he admitted. "I'm not always generous." She'd smiled then, something tired but genuine in it. "But I'm trying to build something that actually learns from this, not just punishes one man and calls the problem solved." The board's report concluded with a directive that struck Jace as the first piece of corporate language he'd read in this entire process that he actually believed. A complete overhaul of safety protocols across every Kensington Global facility, an end to internal-only safety certifications, and the creation of a new executive position with direct board-level authority over operational safety and systems integrity. A position with the explicit power to halt operations at any facility immediately, without requiring approval from regional directors or budget committees, if employee or public safety was credibly at risk. Aurora had looked at him directly when that last provision was read aloud during the final board session, and Jace had understood, even before she said anything to him privately afterward, exactly what she was thinking. "I want you to be the one who fills that position," she told him 2 days later, sitting across from him in a small coffee shop near his neighborhood rather than her office. A deliberate choice on her part, he suspected, to meet him on ground that felt less like a transaction and more like an honest conversation between two people who'd been through something significant together. Not as a publicity gesture. Not because it photographs well to put the contractor who saved the building in charge of preventing the next one. Because you're the only person in this entire process who actually looked at that facility and told the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient and nobody wanted to hear it. Jace turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, considering it with the same careful weight he gave every decision that mattered. "I'm not an executive, Ms. Kensington. I'm an electrician with a GED and a Navy record. I don't know the first thing about board meetings or budget committees." "You know more about what actually matters than most of the executives sitting in those board meetings," Aurora said. "And you can call me Aurora, by the way. I think we're past Ms. Kensington at this point." Something in that small correction, offered gently, landed somewhere he hadn't quite expected, and he allowed himself, for just a moment, to actually consider what she was offering. Not just the job itself, but the life that might come with it. The chance to build something that protected people instead of just discovering, after the fact, how badly they'd been failed. "I'd need guarantees," he said finally. "Real ones. Not the kind that get quietly walked back 6 months in when budget season comes around. Employee safety comes before profit, every time, no exceptions, written into whatever contract I sign in language specific enough that nobody can argue around it later." "I'll write it myself," Aurora said, "and I'll make sure the board signs off on language with no ambiguity left in it." He looked at her for a long moment. The woman who'd driven out to a fire scene at 4 a.m. instead of sending lawyers, who'd called him personally instead of letting an assistant handle an inconvenient email, who'd sat across from a corrupt executive and refused to look away from what the evidence actually showed, even when it would have been easier, politically, to manage the story instead of confronting it. "All right," he said, "let's talk specifics." The contract took 3 weeks to finalize, longer than either of them expected, mostly because Jace refused to sign anything until he'd read every line himself, twice, sometimes asking Aurora to explain corporate language he didn't trust on instinct alone. She never seemed impatient with it. If anything, she told him once, watching him frown over a paragraph about budgetary override authority, that his stubbornness was exactly why she wanted him in the role in the first place. Most people sign what they're handed, she said. You read it like it might be lying to you. Things that look fine on paper usually are lying to you, he said. I learned that the hard way recently. The position came with a title that still felt strange in his mouth the first few times he said it out loud. Director of Operational Safety and Systems Integrity, reporting directly to the board, with the authority to halt any facility's operations immediately if he judged the risk credible. No committee approval required. It came with a salary that made his stomach do something strange the first time he saw the number, more than he'd made in the previous 3 years combined. It came, more importantly to him, with the written guarantee he'd demanded, language specific enough that no future executive could quietly erode it during some budget season 2 years down the line. Safety took precedence over cost, full stop, no exceptions carved out for inconvenient timing or unfavorable quarters. He didn't take the job because of the money, though he wasn't foolish enough to pretend the money didn't matter. He took it because somewhere in those 3 weeks of reading contracts at his kitchen table, late at night after Mia was asleep, he'd started to understand that this was a chance to make sure no other technician ever walked into a building like Facility 7 without knowing exactly what they were walking into. No other security guard would have to call a stranger at 3 in the morning because nobody else was picking up. No other company would get to bury a year's worth of warnings under a dashboard full of comfortable lies. He signed the contract on a Tuesday morning in Aurora's office, with Priya as witness and a notary Aurora had arranged in advance. And when he set the pen down, Aurora reached across the desk and shook his hand with the same directness she brought to everything. No performance in it. Just two people who'd been through something difficult together and come out the other side with more respect for each other than either had expected at the start. Welcome to Kensington Global, she said. Try not to make me regret it. I'll do my best. No promises. The first 90 days in the role taught Jace more about the actual texture of corporate dysfunction than he'd learned in his entire career as a contractor, mostly because he was finally positioned to see how systemic the problem at Facility 7 had actually been. Not an isolated failure, but a symptom of a culture that had, for years, prioritized comfortable reporting over honest reporting at nearly every level. He spent the first month simply visiting facilities, all of them. Every site Kensington Global operated across 6 states, walking the floors the way he'd walked the floor of that battery room his first night on the job, talking to the technicians and security guards and maintenance crews who actually understood the daily reality of these buildings far better than any executive summary ever could. He found smaller versions of the same pattern in 2 other locations. Not falsified data on the scale of Facility 7, nothing approaching that level of deliberate concealment, but maintenance deferred past safe windows, safety equipment that hadn't been properly inspected in longer than regulations allowed, the slow erosion of standards that happened when nobody with real authority ever bothered to check whether the comfortable numbers on a dashboard actually matched the equipment generating them. He fixed what he found. Not by issuing memos from a distant office, but by standing in those rooms with the technicians and engineers who worked them every day, asking the same kind of direct, unglamorous questions he'd once asked himself in Facility 7's battery room, the questions that mattered far more than any quarterly summary ever could. What's actually happening here? Not what's the report say. What do you see with your own eyes? Every single shift. The technicians noticed the difference. The way people always notice when someone in authority actually listens instead of performing the appearance of listening. Word spread quickly through the company's lower ranks that this new director wasn't another suit who'd disappear back into an office after a single scheduled site visit. He showed up unannounced sometimes, asked questions that assumed real expertise from the people answering them, and most importantly, when problems were flagged, things actually changed instead of disappearing into the same machinery of deflection that had nearly killed him in that battery room. Aurora noticed something else entirely, something that built slowly over those first months in a way neither of them had fully planned for, or for a while, fully acknowledged. She started joining him on site visits when her schedule allowed, not as a formality, but because she'd discovered, working alongside him, the particular value of seeing her own company through eyes that refused to accept polish over substance. She stood beside him in loud, unglamorous maintenance bays, talking to electricians who'd spent 20 years in trades nobody in her social circle had ever thought to ask about, and found herself understanding her own business in a way no MBA program or executive briefing had ever managed to teach her. You make people tell the truth just by showing up and actually wanting to hear it, she told him once. The two of them standing in a parking lot after a site visit to a facility in Ohio, watching the sun go down over an unremarkable stretch of industrial road. Most executives walk through these places and everyone performs for them. Nobody performs for you. They just tell you what's actually wrong. Because I used to be the guy on the other side of that conversation, Jace said. I know what it sounds like when somebody's asking because they care about the answer versus asking because it's on a checklist. I'm trying to learn that difference, Aurora admitted. It doesn't come naturally to me. I grew up around people who measured competence by how confidently you could present a number, not by whether the number was actually true. You're learning it faster than most people in your position ever bother to. She'd looked at him for a long moment after that, something unguarded passing between them that neither one named out loud. Not yet. Both of them still finding their footing in a relationship that had started as a contractor's email and a CEO's phone call, and had slowly, without either fully planning it, become something neither could quite categorize as purely professional anymore. Mia noticed the change in her father before he fully admitted it to himself. She was sharp in the particular way only children raised by a single attentive parent could be, attuned to shifts in mood and routine that adults often assumed went unnoticed. She noticed that her father came home earlier now, most nights, that the deep exhaustion that used to follow him through the door after overnight jobs had been replaced with something steadier, calmer. She noticed, too, the way he sometimes smiled at his phone in a particular way when a text came through in the evening, a smile he didn't seem fully aware he was making. "Is that Aurora?" she asked one evening, completely without warning, while he was making dinner and his phone buzzed on the counter beside him. He nearly dropped the spoon he was holding. "What makes you ask that?" "You smile different when it's her." Mia said it with the simple, devastating honesty of a 6-year-old who hadn't yet learned to soften observations for adult comfort. "You smile regular for Aunt Renee. This is a different smile." He didn't have a good answer for that, partly because he wasn't entirely sure himself how to characterize what had grown, slowly and almost without his noticing, between himself and a woman who ran one of the largest technology companies in the country. They talked most evenings now, ostensibly about work, facility updates, board meeting preparation, the slow rebuilding of a safety culture that touched nearly every corner of Kensington Global. But the conversations had drifted, over weeks, into territory that had nothing to do with batteries or budgets, into the kind of late-evening honesty that happened between two people who'd started trusting each other with more than just professional concerns. She'd asked him once, on one of those calls, what his life had actually been like before the Navy, before Mia, before any of it, a question nobody had really asked him in years, most people content to know him only through the shape of his most recent struggles. He'd found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone, about growing up with a father who'd left the same way Mia's mother eventually would, about the particular fear of becoming exactly what he'd watched his own father become, and how Mia had somehow, simply by needing him completely, taught him how not to. She'd told him things too, about building her first company at 23 with nothing but a maxed-out credit card and a stubborn refusal to fail, about the particular loneliness of being underestimated by every investor and partner she'd ever worked with, about the complicated weight of inheriting her father's company, under circumstances that still, 8 months later, felt more like a crisis than an honor. Somewhere in those conversations, something had shifted between them, quiet and unhurried. Neither one rushing toward a label, neither felt entirely ready to claim. "It's complicated, baby girl," he told Mia honestly, setting the spoon down. "Aurora's someone I respect a lot. We're becoming good friends." "Good friends who smile the different smile," Mia said, with the air of someone closing a debate she considered already won, and went back to coloring at the kitchen table, leaving her father standing there with a small, helpless laugh caught in his chest. It was Aurora who finally said something direct, 3 months into Jace's position during a quiet evening after a long week of facility audits. The two of them sharing a meal at a small restaurant near her office, rather than the usual conference rooms and site visits that had defined most of their time together so far. "I want to ask you something," she said, setting down her fork with a deliberateness that told him this wasn't a casual question. "And I want you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." "All right. Do you feel what I think I'm feeling, or am I imagining something that isn't actually there and making this entire working relationship strange for no reason. He sat with the question for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give it the weight it deserved rather than rushing towards something easy. "I feel it," he said finally. "I felt it for a while now, if I'm honest. I just wasn't sure it was appropriate to say anything, given everything else. The job, the company, the fact that you're my employer in every technical sense that matters." "I've thought about that too," Aurora admitted, "and I don't have a perfect answer for how we navigate it. But I know I don't want to keep pretending I don't notice the way you talk to me differently than you talk to anyone else in that building. I don't want to keep pretending the reason I started joining your site visits had anything to do with operational oversight." "That obvious?" "To everyone except apparently the two of us, yes." A small, genuine laugh escaped her, the kind that hadn't shown up much in the formal, careful version of herself she usually presented at work. "Priya's been making comments about it for weeks. I kept telling her she was imagining things. Mia figured it out before either of us said anything out loud. Smart kid." "She usually is." He reached across the table in instinct rather than a calculated decision, and took her hand the way he might have taken it months ago if circumstances had been simpler, if she'd been anyone other than the CEO of the company that now employed him. "I don't know exactly how we make this work, given everything that's complicated about it. But I know I'd rather try and figure it out than keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." "Then let's figure it out," Aurora said, her hand tightening around his. "Slowly. Honestly. No performing for anyone, including ourselves." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, not the kind of sweeping romantic gesture either of them might have expected from the trajectory of everything that had happened since that first overnight inspection. No grand public moment, no swelling sense of cinematic inevitability. It was two tired, imperfect people, both of them carrying their own particular weight of past disappointment and hard-won caution, choosing honesty over comfortable silence, which felt, to both of them, like exactly the right way for something real to actually begin. The months that followed weren't free of difficulty, because nothing real ever was, and Jace would have distrusted a version of this story that pretended otherwise. There were board members who raised quiet concerns about the appearance of a relationship between the CEO and a senior executive she'd personally recruited, conversations that required careful, transparent handling, full disclosure to the board, a formal review by outside counsel to ensure no conflict of interest compromised the integrity of Jace's safety authority, a process both of them welcomed rather than resisted, because they understood better than most people in their positions exactly how dangerous it was when powerful people assumed their own good intentions excused them from scrutiny. There were nights when the demands of Aurora's role pulled her away from dinners she'd promised Mia she'd attend, leaving a 6-year-old disappointed in a way that required careful, honest conversation rather than empty reassurance. There were moments when Jace's own instinct towards self-sufficiency, the particular stubbornness that had carried him alone through deployments and single fatherhood and 4 years of contracting work, clashed against the unfamiliar experience of actually letting someone else carry part of a burden alongside him. But underneath the difficulty was something steadier than either of them had expected, a partnership built not on the dramatic crisis that had first brought them together, but on the slower, more ordinary work of two people learning to trust each other in the unglamorous daily texture of real life. Grocery runs and school pickups and long phone calls about facility audits. Aurora learning the specific rhythm of Mia's asthma management with the same careful attentiveness she brought to systems integrity reports. Jace learning, slowly, that letting someone in didn't have to mean losing the independence that had defined so much of his adult life. Aurora made a deliberate choice, in those months, that surprised her own executive team more than almost anything else she'd done since taking over the company. She started spending a full day each week on the floor of various facilities, not as a publicity gesture, but because her time with Jace had taught her something her father, despite all his wisdom, had never quite managed to instill in her during her years of preparation to eventually take his place. The truth about any organization didn't live in the polished reports executives received. It lived in the daily, unglamorous reality of the people actually doing the work, the people who knew, long before any falsified dashboard would admit it, exactly when something was beginning to go wrong. "I used to think leadership meant having all the answers," she told Jace one evening, the two of them sitting on his porch while Mia rode her bike up and down the quiet street in the long summer evening light, Renee's kids racing alongside her, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a life Jace had spent years building carefully around his daughter. Now I think it means knowing which questions to ask, and trusting the people who actually know the answers. That's most of what kept my team alive overseas, Jace said. Nobody in charge pretended to know everything. The ones who survived were the ones who actually listened to the guys on the ground. I'm trying to be that kind of leader. I don't always get it right. Nobody does. That's not really the goal. He watched Mia pedal past, laughing at something one of Renee's kids had said, her hair streaming out behind her, healthy and steady and entirely unaware of how close her father had once come to not making it home from a building she'd never even known existed. The goal's just trying, every day, even when it's inconvenient. Most people stop trying the second it costs them something. That's the whole difference, far as I can tell. Listen. A year after that first overnight inspection, Kensington Global's safety record had transformed in ways that went well beyond the headline metrics the board reviewed each quarter, though those metrics had improved dramatically too. Incident reports down sharply across every facility, near-miss reporting up significantly, a shift that Jace understood not as workers suddenly becoming careless before and careful now, but as a culture finally trusting that flagging a problem would lead to action instead of punishment or dismissal. He'd hired a small team to support the work, technicians and engineers he'd recruited specifically because they shared his particular allergy to comfortable lies dressed up as reassuring data, people who understood that real safety work meant occasionally being the person in the room nobody wanted to hear from, the one insisting on the inconvenient truth instead of the easy reassurance. Facility 7 itself had been fully rebuilt. The battery network replaced entirely with updated technology and redundant, independently verified monitoring systems that made the kind of falsification Mercer had orchestrated essentially impossible going forward. Multiple overlapping sensor networks, regular third-party audits built permanently into the operational budget rather than treated as an optional expense, alarm protocols that physically couldn't be disabled without triggering an automatic notification to Jace's office and the board simultaneously. He visited the rebuilt facility on a quiet afternoon in early spring, 14 months after that first overnight contract, walking through a battery room that looked nothing like the dim, dust-coated space he remembered. Bright now, properly maintained, humming with the particular clean efficiency of equipment that was actually being cared for rather than quietly neglected behind a screen of false reassurance. He brought Mia and Aurora with him, a small family outing that felt strange in its ordinariness, given everything that had once happened inside the same building. Mia walking between them, holding both their hands, asking a constant stream of curious questions about the equipment that Jace patiently answered, simplifying the technical language into terms a 7-year-old, she'd had a birthday since all of this began, could understand and enjoy. "This is where you got hurt?" Mia asked at one point, standing in the corridor leading to the main battery room, her expression serious in a way that made both adults exchange a glance over her head. "This is where I got hurt," Jace confirmed, crouching down to her level the way he always did for conversations that mattered. "But it's also where I made sure the building got fixed, so nobody else would get hurt the same way. That's the part that matters most." "Were you scared?" He considered lying, considered the easier, more comfortable answer a lot of parents might have offered a child this age. But honesty had become something he valued too deeply, by this point in his life, to abandon it even in moments meant to comfort. "A little," he admitted. "But sometimes being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're doing something that actually matters, something important enough to be worth being scared about." Mia considered this with the careful gravity she brought to everything, then reached up and hugged him around the neck, careful, the way she'd been ever since seeing his bandaged arm that morning so many months ago. "I'm glad you weren't too scared to fix it," she said simply. Aurora, standing beside them, watched the exchange with an expression Jace had come to recognize over the past year. Not performance, not the careful composure she maintained in boardrooms, but something genuinely unguarded. The particular tenderness of someone who'd come to love not just him, but the entire small, imperfect, devoted world he'd built around protecting his daughter. Moti. They walked out of the facility together as the afternoon light slanted gold across the parking lot, and Mia ran ahead toward the car, energy boundless in the way of 7-year-olds who'd just spent an hour exploring something genuinely fascinating, leaving Jace and Aurora to follow at a slower pace. "I have something for you," Aurora said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a folded piece of paper, slightly creased from being carried around for what looked like several days. "Mia gave it to me this morning before we left. She made me promise not to look at it until we got here." Jace raised an eyebrow, watching Aurora unfold the paper carefully. It was a child's drawing, done in the careful, earnest style of a 7-year-old still developing real artistic skill, but compensating entirely with effort and intention. 2 stick figures and a smaller one between them, standing in front of a building rendered in crayon, the morning sun drawn in the corner with careful yellow rays. Across the top, in Mia's careful, still developing handwriting, was a single word: hope. Aurora stood there for a long moment, looking at the drawing, and Jace watched something move across her face that he recognized immediately, having felt versions of it himself more times than he could count over the past 14 months. The particular unexpected ache of being loved by a child who'd chosen, entirely on her own terms, to extend that love beyond the one parent who'd earned it through years of devotion. "She told me this morning that this was the picture of the morning we first met," Aurora said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I didn't even know she remembered that morning so clearly. She was so small that day, watching from the truck while we talked at the gate." "She remembers more than people give her credit for," Jace said. "Always has." Aurora looked up from the drawing, meeting his eyes with an openness that had taken both of them a long, careful year to build. "I came out here that morning expecting a liability problem, a contractor exaggerating findings, an inconvenient story I'd need to manage before it became a bigger headache for the company. I never expected—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the building behind them, the little girl waiting impatiently by the car, the whole unexpected shape her life had taken since that first phone call at 3 a.m. "I never expected any of this. I built my entire first career believing the biggest investments worth making were always the ones you could measure: capital, market share, technology. I think this is the first time I've understood that the greatest investment I ever made wasn't any of that." "What was it then?" "Trusting one stubborn, exhausted electrician who refused to stay quiet, even when staying quiet would have been so much easier." She folded the drawing carefully and tucked it back into her bag, like something precious she intended to keep for a long time. Trusting that courage and integrity were worth more than polished reports and comfortable lies. "You taught me that, Jace. Not in a speech, just by being exactly who you are, every single day, even when nobody was paying attention." He didn't have a clever response for that, didn't particularly want one. He just reached over and took her hand, the same way he had that first evening at the restaurant. The gesture less tentative now, worn smooth by a year of choosing each other, imperfectly but genuinely, day after day. They reached the car, where Mia was already buckled in, swinging her legs with the restless energy of a child ready for whatever came next. And as Jace pulled out of the parking lot, the rebuilt facility shrinking in his rearview mirror, he found himself thinking about the particular shape his life had taken since that first desperate night. Accepting a contract nobody else wanted because his daughter needed medicine he couldn't otherwise afford. He hadn't set out to expose corporate corruption. He hadn't set out to fall in love with a woman who ran one of the largest companies in the country, or to become an executive himself, a version of his own life he never would have predicted even a year and a half earlier. He'd set out simply to do an honest night's work and collect an honest paycheck. And somewhere along the way, doing the right thing when it would have been so much easier not to had reshaped everything about the life he and his daughter were building together. That, he thought, watching Mia in the rearview mirror, already chattering about what they should have for dinner, was probably the truest lesson in all of it. That integrity rarely announced itself as something heroic in the moment it actually mattered. Most of the time, it just looked like one tired man, refusing to look away from something inconvenient, because somewhere behind him, depending on him completely, was someone worth that refusal. The facility behind them kept humming quietly in the afternoon light, safe now, honest now, its monitoring systems telling the truth for the first time in years. And ahead of them, the road stretched out toward an ordinary evening: dinner, homework, an early bedtime for Mia. A quiet conversation between two people still learning, patiently and imperfectly, how to build a life together out of the wreckage of what corporate greed had nearly destroyed. It wasn't a perfect ending because nothing real ever was. But it was an honest one, built by people who'd chosen, again and again, when it would have been easier not to tell the truth instead of the comfortable lie. And for Jace Callahan, who'd spent so many years believing that survival was the only thing he had left to offer the world, that honesty, finally, felt like more than enough.